So good morning and welcome to all of you. It's a joy to be here as always. And this morning we're talking about strange artworks. We're talking about works that might prompt you to ask, is that art? And we're going to be doing this in 4 bite-sized discussions. So we'll be starting with On Kawara, who you see at the top left of the screen, who is engaged in very boring artworks that are so kind of dry and banal that you would wonder why someone might make them. We're then going to be moving into artworks that make us feel a little bit squirmish, which we might describe as revolting or disgusting. Down the bottom with Frances Elise, we're going to be thinking about pointless artworks, the kind of artworks that don't really achieve anything and get us nowhere. And finally, we'll be looking at artists like Cindy Sherman, who kind of hide their art practice in full view. So what I mean by that is artists who make art that intentionally doesn't look like artworks. At the end of each of these 4 discussions, there will be time for questions and comments. So please do use the chat function and I'll endeavour to get back to you. Okay, let's dive in, starting with On Kawara. Michaela, let's launch our first poll for this morning. Today, I'm asking you, what time did you wake up this morning? Are you in Brisbane? Was it way too early? When the birds started singing, maybe when your alarm went off, and maybe some of us in the audience aren't awake yet. I'll give you a few more moments to answer that question. So this is a 12-year artwork recording when the artist woke up. So for 12 years, between 1968 and 1979, On Kawara sent 2 postcards every day to friends and colleagues recording the time that he got up. This was part of a bigger self-observation series, and it included 2 other artworks. All right, I'm just going to look at that poll before we move on. A quarter of us got up too early. A very nice percentage of us got up with the birds. A few of us got up when the alarm went off. I'm actually surprised. Normally our dog and our cat wakes us up, but today it was with the alarm and a few of us aren't awake yet. That's okay. Take your time. Ease into your weekend. So this artwork is about, it's part of his self-observation series. It included 2 other artworks, one called I Went, where he mapped where he had travelled each day on a street map, and another work called I Met, where he listed the people that he had met with each day. So this is a kind of ritualistic recording of everyday occurrences. It's quite deliberately and explicitly a work that anyone could make. In total, he sent over 8,000 postcards through the mail system, and he only stopped this series when his stamping materials were sadly stolen. So what makes this art? Well, On Kawara is an absolutely iconic conceptual artist. He belongs to a group of artists who are attempting to expand the definition of art, less emphasis on creative genius and single or precious objects, in favor of an emphasis on ideas and data. So as part of this kind of conceptual drive, On Kawara did not make these postcards. Instead, he selected quite uninteresting tourist postcards. He didn't even handwrite the messages, so we don't even kind of have that sense of the artistic significance in the artist's signature or handwriting. Instead, he's using stamps. This is a way of distancing his creativity and his individuality from the project in favor of what's known as a kind of corporate or industrial aesthetic. And this corporate aesthetic is going to be quite important at the end of the talk, so keep that in mind. Conceptual art is a kind of extension of Duchamp's ready-made and found objects. There's an interest in Duchamp's aesthetic disinterest. So in other words, artworks like this are intentionally, at first glance, rather dry, uninteresting, and uninformative. But if we stick with this artwork, if we stay with it and kind of move past this initial interpretation, then it starts to get interesting. If we view the project collectively, kind of gather all of the postcards together, we start seeing patterns. So I want you to look at that collection of postcards on the left. And you might see, for example, that there are kind of patterns in the order and selection of postcards that he sent out. It's been described as though he was taking you on a kind of postcard tour of Manhattan. We could also say that this is a kind of database of the New York art world. So Lucy Lippard, for example, who he sends this postcard to, was a very significant feminist art critic. We also have the very deliberate ambiguity of the language that he's using. So he says, I got up, and this could be interpreted in three different ways. We might interpret it as the time that he woke up, the time that he got out of bed, or even times that he was aroused throughout the day. But of course, at the kind of heart of this work is time and the connotations of time. So when you answered that poll that I gave you, what time did you wake up today? Was there an emotion attached to that? Did you feel proud of the time that you woke up? Maybe a little bit self-righteous? Or did you maybe feel a little bit guilty if you pressed snooze a few too times? I want to draw your attention to the fact that in this postcard, he's telling Lucy Lippard that he woke up at 4:28 p.m. in the afternoon. Did you have an immediate kind of gut reaction to that time? Did you think that that was very late in the day? And then did you start thinking about that as being maybe something that's specific to artists? Are artists lazy or unproductive? Or do they have different rituals to non-artists? And so what I'm getting at here is that although this data on the one hand is very dry, it also is immediately linked to cultural interpretations of what it means to sleep in or wake up. And I want to explore this kind of temporal aspect a little bit more. Here we have three further artists who are exploring, investigating, documenting, and undoing time. On the left, we have 8 screenshots from a film called The Clock. This is a 24-hour film, and it's made by collaging together excerpts from film and TV. Every single scene that the artist has chosen reveals a timekeeping device. And what he does is collage all of these together so that they sync with real time. So for example, when you watch the film and you see 4:05 on the screen, it is also 4:05 in real life. The curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Rachel Kent, has described this as a kind of uncanny correspondence between cinematic and real time. We could also say that the work is a kind of database of what we do at different times of the day. So over the course of the 24 hours, It shows scenes of being asleep, of waking up and getting ready for work, of going out drinking and partying, of the kind of late night crime that takes place on the streets, and of sleeping and dreams. So in other words, it's kind of revealing these overarching structures of labor and of leisure that relate to different times throughout the day. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have two artworks that have quite recently been on show at QAGOMA. You might have seen them in the exhibition Work, Work, Work. Up the top is a photograph of a nuclear clock. This is a clock that counts backwards to 0 hour. And this is specifically an appropriated photograph, so not the photograph that Brooke Andrew has taken, a pre-existing photograph. And it specifically references the atomic bomb testing that was carried out by the British in remote regions of Australia during the 50s and the 60s. This is just one photograph of a larger series by Brooke Andrew. All of the photographs are appropriated and all of them have connections to colonization and institutions of knowledge. Here, Brooke Andrew is thinking specifically about Western ideas of time. He's thinking about the unstoppable march of time and the kind of violence that is implicit to ideas of experimentation and progress. Beneath him, we have a work by Martin Creed. Martin collects together 39 metronomes and asks for them to be placed in a single line along the gallery floor, and then set to demonstrate the full range of metronome tempos. So if you have a look at the photograph, you can see that their little ticking elements aren't in unison, but instead they're quite chaotic and out of order. Imagine this artwork playing out in the quiet space of the gallery and filling it with a cacophonous sound of order and disorder, this kind of dissonant ticking. So here, Martin Creed is taking a useful object, an object that is about measure and rule and order, and he's turning it into something chaotic, something quite pleasurable in undoing the purpose of these objects. So these artists are all thinking about pre-existing imagery and pre-existing objects connected to time, but they're making them kind of chaotic, recontextualized and recollaged in their artworks. So this is one way of thinking about On Kawara's postcard works in relation to time. I also want to draw out another element of his artwork here in terms of correspondence. So On Kawara's letter writing was rather dry, didn't have any kind of emotion or interesting input. But both of these artworks are about the kind of heart-wrenching scenarios in our lives that might be connected to letter writing and correspondence. I want to start with Sophie Kaye on the left. And to understand this artwork, I want you to remember a moment when someone has been unfaithful, when they've broken up with you or let you down, and the kind of rich, complex, heart-wrenching emotions of that time period. Working through that pain is at the heart of this artwork. The artist had received an email from a boyfriend letting her know that he could no longer be faithful to her, and so he was ending the relationship. He signed off this email with the glib phrase, "Take care of yourself." And the artist has described this as ending with a sentence that was violent in its formality. She said it was like a pilot-like washing of hands, a kind of brusque dismissal of me. Kaye railed against the impersonality of this email by sharing it with 107 diverse professional women. So we see them all here in this documentation, a kind of range of women with a printout of this email letter. And she asked them to read and interpret the letter for her according to the language of their profession. So a sharpshooter used the letter for target practice. An etiquette consultant critiqued his manners. A lawyer determined that this letter deserved 2 years in jail. An author transformed it into a children's story, and a copy editor, I think this one is my favorite, a copy editor marked up all of his grammatical mistakes. So here I'm kind of thinking about the ambiguity of language, which we first encountered in On Kawara's postcard, where he kind of is thinking about 3 ways of interpreting that simple little phrase, I got up. Kaye, by contrast, explodes this ambiguity. So she's making possible over 100 different interpretations and responses to a letter. So here we have a sense of the kind of different interpretations of communication as endless. Another kind of interesting aspect about this work is that it's a gathering together of women. So there's a kind of sense of sisterhood in the mourning process of the breakup, but these are specifically professional women, and they are all bringing their expertise to this job. So it's an interesting kind of bringing together of the feminine and sisterhood with professionalism and the diverse languages of professionalism. Kaye explains this as her way of kind of outsourcing and working through the breakup, of exhausting the emotion of that period. Really kind of interesting way of working through a breakup. On the right, we have a Taiwanese American artist, Mingwei, known for his work in participatory art. So here the artist is thinking about ways of involving the audience. Extraordinary grief was also the starting point for this artwork. The artist created it after his grandma passed away, when he felt like there were things that were essential, but he had left unsaid. So this artwork is a kind of response to that grief and the trauma of feeling like there were words that hadn't been shared. What he gives the audience is 3 writing booths. At each booth, he invites us to write a letter that is connected to gratitude, insight, or forgiveness. Members of the audience can either address these to a recipient, in which case the gallery will send it off for you, or they can leave the letter in the gallery for others to read. So in artworks like this, an artist is creating a safe space, a space of introspection. He's nurturing us and encouraging us to kind of slow down and think about the ones that we love and to put those thoughts into words. For Mingwei, it's important that this work is about handwritten letters. So this is also part of that slowing down process of putting away our phones and the kind of rush of capitalism and technology in order to be present and in order to give time to connections and to care. Okay, so that is our first little series on artworks exploring time and communication. So let's have a look at any questions or comments that might have brought up. So Leslie says that On Kawara is kind of like an early version of tweeting. Absolutely, with that really kind of like snipped communication and a sense of documenting everything that is done. And Selena similarly says all of this would be recorded on smartphones now. Nadia says only a conceptual artist would see it through for 12 years until the tools were stolen. I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting to think how long he might have pushed that artwork if he still had the stamps. Kirsty says, I just thought he'd been out drinking and only got home at 5 o'clock. Absolutely. We've all been there. And I think someone called Louise says the story of how each professional woman responded in Take Care of Yourself is so great. It made me laugh, but the original breakup for the artist made me feel sad. Yeah, so really kind of interesting thinking about the different emotions that Take Care of Yourself brings out. Natasha says letter writing is important. Some people's handwritings can be works of art. And Mingwei says, was that work at GOMA? Yes, it was. It was recently at GOMA. And Michaela says it's part of the QAGOMA Collection. So if we're lucky, we might see it on show again soon. All right, let's keep moving on. All of the artworks on your screen are made from the fluids or parts of the human body. Take a moment to look at them. Can you decipher what contribution the body has made to each artwork? How do they make you feel? How would you describe them? And Michaela, let's launch our second poll. How would you describe these artworks made with body parts and fluids? Are they surprising, confronting, revolting, or mesmerizing? Revolting is in front so far. Let me tell you briefly about them. So starting at the top left, Sarah Sudhoff documents the stains that are left after someone dies. Andrea Serrano finds a beautiful and ethereal quality in urine. Anne Noble photographs the toxic traces of lollies on her daughter's lips. Charlie Sofo collects human hairs from public libraries and turns them into line drawings. We then have Helen Chadwick, who is looping together golden locks and intestines. Janine and Tony has worn away these two self-portrait sculptures. The one on the left is made out of chocolate and she's licked at it. The one on the right is made of soap and she's used that to clean herself. He Zhang Yu makes a miniature sculpture out of real human teeth. And then finally, possibly the most revolting, Mark Quinn actually collects his own blood and then freezes it into a self-portrait bust. And not just once, he's done this multiple times. Whoa. All right, let's reveal those answers. We have some surprising, the leader is confronting, revolting, and about a quarter of us on mesmerizing. So in art history, works that are made from the body call to mind the Bulgarian French philosopher Julia Kristeva and her theory of the abject. According to Kristeva, the abject describes elements of the body that threaten our ideas of ourselves as contained and complete. She says the abject is that which exists in the liminal spaces, both inside and outside the body. And so what she means is things like blood, tears, urine, saliva, and vomit. So things that came from inside but are now existing outside the body. She says that these abject substances produce disgust, even horror. So we seek to distance ourselves from them in order to reinstate the vision of ourselves as fixed and whole. So when artists use these materials, they are thinking about the capacity for art to produce heightened emotions in the viewer. So they're wanting us to feel something, whether that's surprised, confronted, revolted, or mesmerized. But another really kind of strong impulse in contemporary practice is about asking us to change how we see things and how we feel about them. So for example, we might look at those first two photographs, Sarah Sudhoff and Andrea Serrano, and thinking about how they may be changing substances of blood and urine into something quite beautiful. And it's along this line of thinking that the artist Casey Jenkins works. So to the left, we see one continuous knitted scarf that has been looped over a series of coat hangers and is suspended in a gallery space. Most of the knitting is a kind of warm off-white natural colour from the sheep, but we can also see delicate smudges of blood. We can then see on the right the much more close-up image of the artist knitting, again with blood smeared across her fingers, her knitting needles, and the scarf. So at first we might think that these are the product of an injury. Maybe this is a comment on the undervalued pain, repetition, and labour of women's domestic work. But in actuality, this blood is from the artist's vagina. While she's been sitting in the gallery knitting, she has inserted a spool of wool into her body, and then she's pulled it out in order to knit over the course of a month. Of course, over the course of a month, she has had her menstrual cycle. So what we're looking at is period blood. So knowing this, how do you feel about looking at this photograph? Maybe tell me in the comments how this artwork makes you feel. Jenkins describes casting off my womb as an attempt to normalize period blood and menstruating bodies. So she's quite deliberately taking this natural process of the body into the public space of the gallery. I want you to notice that this is quite a restrained, delicate, traced kind of form of menstrual blood. So here it's not presented as gory or as shameful, but actually is something quite familiar and restrained. Of course, we can't talk about Casey Jenkins' casting off my womb without mentioning this iconic artwork by Carolee Schneemann called Interior Scroll. Carolee Schneemann explains this performance as a way of her trying to figure out an answer to the question, can a nude woman be an image and an image maker? So this work here is another performance work. It involves the artist standing on a tabletop in front of an audience where she first read out excerpts from a book and also marked her body with lines of mud. We can just see them in the photograph. She then withdrew a very long and carefully folded piece of paper from her vagina, and she read out this document to the audience. So the document is an imaginary dialogue between two filmmakers. One is arguing for the superiority of a masculine logic in filmmaking, while the artist is defending her feminine creativity as born from the body and therefore inherently messy. How does this photograph make you feel? Why do you think the artist has pulled her speech from within her body? Give you just a moment there. So throughout history, artistic genius has been culturally aligned with masculinity. There's been a kind of dichotomy where creativity and culture has been aligned with men, whereas procreativity, giving birth, has been women's domain. In this work, Schneemann is literally and metaphorically repositioning women's vagina, previously that mark of otherness, or to use Freud's terms, a mark of lack, into a container of creativity, language, and knowledge. So kind of repositioning this internal cavity in women's bodies as a font of creativity. And that is it for this little section on surprising materials in artworks. Thea says, I wonder how these artworks are dealt with under workplace health and safety regulations. In my workplace, we would never be able to handle something like this due to health considerations. It's a great question, Thea, and it is certainly one that comes up in contemporary art practice. How do artworks that engage with dead bodies and the materials of the body work into current ideas of OHS? And also into ideas of ethical research. Stephen says it's not necessarily the object itself that disgusts us, but being out of its proper place. Absolutely, and this is exactly what Christeva is getting at. The fact that these things are seen as normal when they're still internal, but once they kind of leave us, we see them as taboo. And Natasha says that Casey Jenkins' work gives new meaning to suffering for your art. Let's move out of the gallery and into the landscape. On the left, we see a single line of people stretching across a sandy dune. And on the right, an assortment of unclothed bodies populating a pond. Let's launch poll number 3. Which group would you rather belong to? Would you like to help move a mountain, or would you like to raise the level of a fish pond? So both of these artworks rely on collective labor, specifically from disadvantaged groups of people. On the left, we have students who are all from the outskirts, the kind of poorer areas of Lima in Peru. On the right, we're looking at migrant men who have all traveled to China's capital in search of work. So what we might refer to as day laborers who are kind of looking for a job on a daily basis. All right, let's reveal that poll. 3/4 of us would like to walk into that rather inviting looking pond. I think that's also where you would find me. For those who are more interested in moving a mountain, I'm interested in hearing why in your comments. That looks hot and hard labor to me. All right, let me tell you a little bit more about each work. So Francis Elise on the left is a Belgian-born and Mexico-based artist. In this work, he has gathered together 500 shovelers to incrementally shift a line of sand over the course of one day. The title of this artwork is referencing the biblical notion that with extraordinary faith, miracles are possible. The work can also be characterized in terms of the artist's motto: maximum effort, minimal result. So there's an incredible amount of labor here, but maybe not for any real outcome. I want you to have a look at those figures closest to the camera in that photograph there, the ones over here on the right-hand side of the screen. We see their bodies bent over, we see the grimace on their faces. This is a hard day of work. But what they're doing is kind of pointless and temporary and has no real kind of evidence. If we were to visit this mountain the very next day, there wouldn't be any trace of their labor. But what the artist did do is he asked everyone who had participated to go home and tell their friends and family about their involvement in this artwork. He was hoping that the kind of story of the day would ripple out into the local community, becoming less about any kind of physical change that they might have made to that mountain, and instead kind of becoming this collective and cohesive parable of community effort, the kind of bringing the community together through the act of storytelling. To the right, we have the Chinese artist Zhang Juan, who is based between China and the US. And this work is actually made 15 years earlier, but has a lot of similarities. Here, he has gathered together 40 volunteers. He has asked them to take off their clothes and to walk into a shallow pond, hoping to raise the level of the water. This work is motivated by a Chinese proverb that says that acting alone, one cannot affect their environment. The implication, of course, is that acting together, people can bring about real change. And if we think of the physics of getting into a bathtub that is filled with water, we know that when you put a body into a field of water, that the level will rise. But of course, this pond is so big and the body is so small that the rising would only be by the tiniest increment, one that is imperceptible to the human eye. So what is the kind of point of this logic of raising this pond? There's a kind of surreal logic that is heightened by this very beautiful documentation where all of the figures turn to face the camera with this rather mute expression. And of course, my absolute favorite part of this artwork is that tiny little child sitting on his father's shoulders. In the age of COVID, we also might think of this artwork in terms of social distancing. It has both elements of loneliness, of these figures being apart, also togetherness in this peculiar performance. So how do we make sense of these kind of absurd performances as artworks? Well, the first place that I would turn is land art. Land art, which I think is possibly my mom's favorite type of art. Land art belongs to the 1960s. It's operating in conversation with conceptual art and performance art, with ideas of expanding what art can be, where it can take place, how it relates to the gallery, and how it relates to audiences. And in this gathering of 4 land artworks, we see 4 kind of typical ways that land art played out. Spiral Jetty in the top left is probably the most famous artwork, land artwork that exists. And this one is concerned with a kind of monumental change to the landscape, kind of thinking about the landscape as a large sculpture that one can play around with. Next to him, we have the husband and wife duo Christo and Jean-Claude, who are known for their temporary interventions. So they would wrap environments with plastic. Bottom left is Nancy Holt. She's taking minimalist industrial sculptures into the landscape. And finally, we have Richard Long, who's kind of working with an opposite logic. He's taking elements from the landscape and bringing them into the gallery. So all of these artworks are about a kind of unusual meeting of nature and culture. They're all about rearranging or relocating elements of the landscape that ask us to see the environment and the objects of the environment in new ways. Land art is also part of that era that questioned who owns art. By making art in remote and site-specific locations, land artists are attempting to circumnavigate or operate outside of the art market and ideas of ownership. I would argue that land art makes sense. It's something that we get. It's quite beautiful. It has a very clear relationship to sculpture. It has the kind of grandness of scale and monumentality and permanency that make it quite easy for us to understand them as artworks. And I would say that this isn't present in the two works that we've seen by Francis, Elise, and Zhang Juan. So maybe we also need to look somewhere else in order to understand their artworks. And I would say that we can find another important forerunner in Joseph Boyce and Fluxus. Here, I'm thinking about the kind of absurdity or pointlessness of contemporary art. What we're looking at is a photograph of the artist, Joseph Boyce. He is inside the gallery Alfred Schmeller in Düsseldorf. And this is actually opening night of his first ever solo exhibition. A crowd of art lovers is waiting outside. They're hoping to see this exhibition. But when they get there, they find that the gallery is locked. The artist is inside. He's dressed in shirt and pants. Over his head, he has honey and gold leaf. And in his arms, he's carrying a dead hare. As the audience watch on, Boyce moves throughout the gallery, appearing to explain his exhibition to the dead hare. But this is at the level of a whisper, so the audience can't hear what he's saying. And this performance goes on for 3 hours. Quite an extraordinary indulgence in explaining his art to a hare. I want to think of this artwork as morbidly impossible on 3 counts. So first of all, hares don't understand human language. But even if hares could understand language, it's very unlikely that they would grasp the esoteric concepts of conceptual art. And even then, if they could understand human language and they could understand contemporary art, this hare is dead. So in this fatalistic performance, Boyce might seem to be suggesting that even talking to a dead hare is more productive than talking to some humans. So it's quite bleak reading of this artwork. A more optimistic reading would be thinking about Boyce as a teacher. He was an art school teacher, and as a shaman. Boyce thought of honey as nourishing and gold as symbolizing purity. He thought of the hare as a resourceful animal that shapes the earth according to its contours and its needs. So if we think about this in the kind of positive symbolism of pedagogy, purity, nourishing, and being at one with the earth, then it kind of transforms into a faith in absurd actions and a kind of loving tenderness for objects and for animals, even in their death. Okay, let's see what comments and questions we have about these three artworks. Helen, this is a very well-known work by Joseph Boyce, so you can probably just minimize your window and Google the image. So Angelique says, Angelique says, maybe the level would rise if everyone did a sneaky little wee. Well, that's very true, and puts Zhang Juan's work in conversation with all of those artists who are making artworks from bodies. Stephen says, you don't change the mountain, but perhaps vice versa. It changes you. Absolutely. I think that's exactly what the Francis Elise is getting at, that maybe there wasn't any kind of permanent change to the mountain, but by bringing together 500 people for a collective action and then asking them to talk about it, asking them to go home and share their experiences, that it becomes a kind of uniting parable, a uniting incident in that town. Nadia says that both the mountain and the pond can be understood in terms of the power of the collective. The proximity and action of the members in each instance is compelling. Absolutely. Oh, great. Good to have you back, Helen. All right, let's move into our final selection of artworks. I'm just going to leave these photographs up on the screen for a moment, give you an opportunity to have a look at them all. And then I'm going to ask Michaela to launch our final poll for today. Can you spot the artwork? Is it the three figures walking across a field? Is it the two men in suits? Is it this kind of gathering of police and film crew? Or is it the women wearing pink beanies? And we've got answers streaming in, but ooh, we've got one person on the correct answer so far. I'll give you a moment more before I turn off that poll. I'll give you another 5 seconds. Quick little poll, this one. All right, let's share our results. What have we guessed? So we all knew that Dan Andrews down in Melbourne was not an artwork. We then have the two men in suits. 10 of us have chosen that one. We have a film crew, about the same have chosen that one. The vast majority of us are thinking of the crowd of women wearing pink beanies. Of course, these women are at a protest in the US, specifically protesting the election of Trump over his sexist and misogynistic language. The artwork is this one by the Yes Men. Of course, this doesn't look like an artwork. Joey's very proud he got that one right. It doesn't look like an artwork. And the reason for that is because it's not meant to. These are artists hiding in plain sight. If we have a look at these two figures, they're kind of nondescript, middle-aged men. They're wearing suits, the kind of language and costume of 9-to-5 businessmen. One has a lanyard possibly pointing to his ID, and the other one is holding a clipboard marked with Shell logo. But if you have a close look at that clipboard, I think the ruse starts to fall apart. That's clearly something that's been printed out and stuck onto a clipboard. So since 1996, Igor Vamos and Jacques Servin have been play acting as the Yes Men. In this specific stunt, they were handing out free snow cones, which they said were made from the last ice caps of the Antarctic. So it's this kind of ridiculous stunt done by corporate businessmen. In addition to these public stunts, they've created faux websites and fake media releases, always play acting at big corporate entities, especially ones engaged in things like petrol. And the hope is that these will be covered on the nightly news. They have twinned goals of drawing attention to social, environmental, and political issues, as well as a critique of neoliberal capitalism, which places the most important decisions about our planet in the hands of the kind of bumbling CEOs and politicians that we see in the world right now. So the Yes Men don't look like artists. Their artworks don't look like art. And this is precisely because they're trying not to. Instead, they're leveraging their nondescript, white, middle-aged male bodies in order to shapeshift into the roles of 9-to-5 corporate businessmen. And when we think of this as a form of masquerade, it puts them in conversation with Cindy Sherman. Of course, for those of us who are lucky enough to be in Brisbane in 2016, we might have seen the Cindy Sherman solo at QAGOMA. Cindy Sherman is the queen of masquerade. For over 40 years, she has repeatedly and consistently photographed herself in various guises. First as film starlets from the 1950s, and then more recently as avant-garde fashionistas, as aging socialites, and as art world snobs. Now, we know that these two are art world snobs because they're holding glasses of champagne, the mark of being at an opening. Here we see the artist doubled. She has the same wig, the same necklace, and the same dress, while the height difference and her two different facial expressions suggest that these are two different women. Now, when we think about Cindy Sherman, we kind of think about a doubling of masquerade. We could say that her costuming is over the top, that her fakery is very easy to spot. And the suggestion here is that women are always already in costume, that femininity itself is a form of masquerade. But I want to use Cindy Sherman to reinterpret the Yes Men. I want to use her to think about the way that businessmen are equally costumed, that businessmen are equally performative. So what I'm thinking about here is kind of complicating ideas of the original and the copy, of authenticity and fakery. And along this line of thinking, I want to finish with the hero image of today's talk, which you saw in marketing. So here we have the South African artist Candace Briefs. Her practice regularly takes the form of multi-channel video works which are about exploring celebrity and fandom. And some of you might have been lucky to have seen this work at QAGOMA. It is an absolutely joyous and slightly embarrassing artwork. It brings together 16 video screens. All of these are fans of Michael Jackson, and they are singing and dancing along to his hit song Thriller. Now, the artist has been a little bit cruel. She doesn't actually play the song in the version that we hear. Instead, she strips it back to just their voices and the kind of awkward shuffling sounds of their feet and their hands clicking and clapping. So all of these figures are copies of Michael Jackson. We can see them mimicking his clothing, especially this fella over here with his pointed collars and this wonderful razzle-dazzle jacket here. We also see them kind of mimicking his dance moves. I want to think of this wonderful, confident, legs planted stance over here. So in a way, all of these figures are copies. And of course, the video also highlights their individuality, their uniqueness. We see a variety of outfits. We see differences in their movements, and we see an incredible range in terms of their confidence and their skill. So here, these ideas of authenticity and fakery, of original and copy, are complex. All of them are both at once a copy and an original. In fact, Briefs is suggesting that authenticity can be found through the practice of mimicking those that we love.